But I think people prefer talking about the positive models that they find in Scandinavia rather than a model for self-determination that doesn't really have particularly good conditions at the moment, let's say.
On the sectarian thing as well, I like the idea you're saying it's an epiphenomenon of football. But I mean, do you think in general that society has moved on? You know, the people are less and less religious. So do you think just even that general movement in society lessens any kind of sectarian issue?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think what we need to do is kill sectarianism off in Scotland, not worry about our constitutional future, because that might lead to a resurgence of sectarianism. I think that it would be quite easy to stop sectarianism in Scotland, much easier than it is in Northern Ireland, and I think gently working to get school children from denominational schools on the same campuses or doing things together, the sorts of things that everybody's comfortable with but that don't necessarily happen, would be really important. However, I mean the thing that I'm always surprised by is that even though I come from Northern Ireland, I've never heard of anywhere like Lark Hall where they put out the green traffic lights.
Do they?
Apparently so.
There you are. Good grief. I wanted to pick up on something you said there, Peter, about the Scandinavian thing, because it was something which I also mentioned in the thing that I wrote, and this sort of Nordic enthusiasm. And one of my big questions about this is always, how much do we really understand what goes on in the Scandinavian places we think we're referring to? And secondly, how much does that rhetoric about Scandinavian states and their social models and their, in this case, identities, how much does that resonate with the ordinary Scot? I would say not all that much, which is one of the reasons why I defend an idea that Ireland is important. I entirely accept the point about the economic basket case, and you can see the kind of the cheap low blow which might be returned to any reference about Ireland from the Better Together campaign. But I think Ireland is just such a bracketing its economic travails. We can talk about it in some ways. You don't have to say that Scotland would be Ireland, but I think we can have less of a kind of zero-sum game in terms of how we think and talk about Ireland in the independence debate, and that it can be a useful and important example for all these kind of cultural things, for responses to, for example, Joanne Lamont and Margaret Curran's rhetoric about foreigners this week. I think it answers in a very concrete way that I'm a bit sceptical that Swedes and Danes and Norwegians really do about those kind of challenges to independence, about what it means really to have an independent government. Peter, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I mean, I think there are some utterly absurd claims made by unionists at times about, I mean, I think, was it Douglas Alexander said you wouldn't be allowed to go and see your granny in Liverpool?
You might have done.
If the SNP won the 2007 election. I don't have a granny in Liverpool, but I feel pretty comfortable about going to see people in Liverpool, even 6 years into an SNP government. I mean, I think it's a good way to kill dead some of the more hyperbolic stuff about how they want to rip families apart and all of this, I think, quite silly rhetoric. But on the other hand, I think the opportunities offered by Scandinavian countries to give different models of what independence might look like. So rather than it looking just like the British state located in Edinburgh rather than in London, is really valuable. And I think that's why a lot of us talk about it as we do, and it's why it has some value. But that's not to say it's the only thing that's of value, and I think sometimes we do talk about it a little bit too much.
Yeah, there's always constant rhetoric about Hadrian's Wall, and it's used by all sides. It's kind of strange. Sometimes you'll see the right-wingers in England saying, oh, rebuild Hadrian's Wall. Sometimes you'll see some of the stranger elements in the pro-Indie group. Yeah, we need to rebuild Hadrian's Wall. And then you see the press using it as, in an independent Scotland, they're going to rebuild Hadrian's Wall. There'll be border checks. It could be like the Great Wall of China. We use it as a tourist attraction.
Yeah, well, we could do that. That would be. I suppose we already exist. I'm pretty sure I've been to the Hadrian's Wall, and it doesn't reach higher than one's waist, so it's merely a light-hearted border you can leap over these days. But I think that's, Peter, to go back to what you were saying there. It must be right. I mean, it's too pessimistic to say that you have to campaign solely with what people believe at the moment and have to convince them in their own terms. I mean, because that way lies the victory of the Daily Mail in most particulars. You have to change how people think if you're going to change how people approach their politics. And therefore, I can see the argument that actually building up this Scandinavian idea, this sort of becoming more lucid and competent and aware about different models of democracy is the way we're going to begin to think about Scotland as a different model of democracy. We're not going to do it any other way. But I just sort of worry that there's a sort of a slight pretension to it, and that's maybe leads me onto this Britishness point, and I wanted to hear what both of you thought about this, because Michael, you referenced the social union, which has been part of SNP rhetoric if you go back into the papers for years and years and years. But there's this conflation going on, I think, by some kind of quite prominent figures, including Andrew Wilson in the Scotland on Sunday last weekend, which say that the way that a social union, the way that convivial neighbourly relations, the way that you could go and see your granny in Liverpool should be talked about and persuade Scots that was still going to happen after independence is by using this language of Britishness. And I'm very, very sceptical about that, because I think a social union I can go with, it's important, it emphasises important things, but I'm just not convinced at all that Britishness here is a particularly useful way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and in your article you're saying you've never felt particularly British, and I'd have to second that, because what does it mean to be British? I mean, there's obviously the geographical part. We are British geographically, but if British means, singing God Save the Queen and that all the Union Jack stuff, and no, I've never felt it. This will get me criticism, but I do not support the British Olympic team when that comes around.
Well, there you go.
It's not necessarily that I want them to lose, but it seems as foreign to me as Spain or Sweden or whoever. I don't feel the need to sort of rally behind that.
Peter, you were talking earlier about, in the DUP context, about them preferring a sort of imagined Britishness as opposed to the actually existing Britishness, I suppose you could describe it as. What do you think about that? Do you think Britishness is a concept which can be effectively co-opted by independence supporters?
I think it's very, very difficult to make. I mean, there's a wide range of arguments made here. I mean, at the event I was at in Aberdeen yesterday, the Green candidate for NEP, Maggie Chapman, was saying that independence isn't about nationalism; it's about what powers we can have. For me, that's a much, much more attractive line of argument, and I think for a lot of people it's going to be a more attractive line of argument. And I think sometimes the SNP, who are a pretty formidable electoral force, get confused between fighting a referendum and fighting an election. And to win a referendum, you have to actually convince people. To win an election, you have to be the least bad option that people think can win. I think that trying to convince people that the SNP are in favour of Britishness, or in some way independence is a way of reinforcing Britishness, is an argument that's just not going to wash if your aim is to convince people that you're right, not just to convince people that you're not as bad as the rest of them. And I think what we need to do is mobilise possibility and talk about what could happen and how we could have nuclear weapons off the Clyde, how we could have a proper social security system, which it looks like Britain's not going to have, how, as James Mitchell says, interestingly, in independent Scotland may be the only place that retains the British NHS.
Because that's what it certainly is an argument you've heard from Sturgeon and others before. That kind of odd, sort of rather counterintuitive thing that the only way to preserve Britain's sort of post-war achievements is independence. But I think not an incredible proposition in that respect. This Britishness thing is much more confusing to me, and I think you're right. And is this points? I mean, one of the points Andrew Wilson made in his article was that something like only 1/10 of people that feel intensely British are going to vote yes on current polling. And my answer to that would be, well, then they're not going to vote yes, so we can't win with them. I mean, I think there is a degree to which with a referendum, obviously we have to win a majority of the vote, but we don't have to win every single person, and trying to win every single person seems to me a very good way of losing a majority of the vote.
Yes. I mean, I'm a Green, and consistently the mistake that Greens make is trying to win 45% of the vote from their existing 5% of the vote, rather than trying to build to anywhere in between. And I think, obviously, you do need to win more than 45% of the vote to win a referendum, but chasing the people who you're least likely to get is likely to be A, a waste of your effort, and B, something that actually puts other people off. And I think the arguments about Britishness are much better articulated as being the arguments about continuity in a Scottish context where there's change at a Westminster level. So were you to have a static British state, the sort of static British state that maybe we had between the early 1950s and the late 1960s, or there was a little bit of a settlement between, let's say, 1993, 1994 through to 2007, were you to have a British state that people could identify and think was going to remain the same, then that would be much more difficult. But we all know that we've got a government that's aggressively committed to ripping up that state, and a Labour Party that's not really interested in rowing back on that any. And that gives you a real opportunity to argue that the British welfare state, social security, the British NHS can only be preserved in an independent Scotland. They can't be preserved by staying in the Union. Ed Miliband at one point came out and said that we needed to retain the Union to retain the NHS, and he hasn't tried to reiterate that line again, probably because they realised just how silly it was.
The other side of it's the cultural Britishness part. There's a lot of absurd statements made along the lines of you won't be able to get Britpop and that sort of stuff. And I always think there's two kind of ways to combat that. One is just to point out that it's patently absurd, because it is. And the second, you could combat it on the lines of British cultural achievements. Yes, Mr. Blobby and Noel Edmonds. Thank you very much. Goodbye. You know, it's another way you could combat that.
I'm not sure Yes Scotland would approve of that with their positive sunbeam fairy message. Mr. Blobby, front of the Union, is probably not in their line. I was going to pick you up there, also there, Peter, on something you referenced and ask you perhaps an impertinent question. You were talking about green strategy there, and I think that's quite interesting. I mean, obviously we'll have a European elections coming up where Maggie Chapman, as you said, is standing for the Greens and has a reasonable chance, I think, of potentially snaring a seat if the Lib Dems go into free fall. And obviously after that we have another Holyrood election, either in an independent Scotland or, if we're still part of the UK, for just Holyrood as a devolved institution. I wondered what are the sort of prospects for the Greens? What do you think the Greens have to do if they're going to really make any advance? Because there's really been, in electoral terms, very few advances in Holyrood since, none, effectively.
Since 2003.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that happened for Greens was that we were very, very good at gaming the system early on. So I think partly because they have the same system in Germany where Greens are very strong, we actually read the system better than anybody else.
Is that the sort of second vote Green strategy when people didn't think about, when the other parties weren't, I mean, it's a point which is made a lot, that the Labour Party didn't think about the regional vote until, after 2011, and the SNP only really began to think about it, say, after 2003.
Yes, and I mean, I think the thing was that we won a lot of seats on a residual second preference for Greens, and that was the right thing to do at the time. And the problem is we've been trying to repeat that ever since, and that requires a much more cautious strategy than the one I think we need. So too often we talk about things that are in our comfort zone, so cycling or bins or whatever else. Too rarely do we talk about the really popular policies we've got that would actually win us votes, things like renationalising the railways. And I think we're, even in Scotland, we're the only party that's really committed to that. Certainly that's in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, there are other groups outside the Scottish Parliament who'd be committed to that. But we don't talk about those things anywhere near enough. And instead, we tend to get fixed on things that make us feel comfortable around what you might call narrow environmental issues. And that, I think, has been where we've really fallen down up to now. I think the independence debate gives us a real opportunity to talk about what our vision for society is, not just what our vision is for when you get your bin collected. And that's really, really important, because green politics is not a pragmatic politics. It's a vision politics. It's about how you want to change the world, not about how you want your pavement to look. And far, far, far too often we've talked about very, very small things. I mean, Robin McAlpine from the Jimmy Reid Foundation once asked me why it was that Greens only ever talked about things for local government in the Scottish Parliament. And I think that was a pretty prescient critique, actually. We talked a lot about things that were that didn't give people any idea who we were or what we were about. We need to talk much more about that. And I think it's interesting because when you look at some of the things that our European candidate Maggie Chapman has